Hi, this is Rabbit, and this is not an Ask Rabbit, but I do hope this will be a very useful podcast. So recently I published a Rabbit Right article on intimacy, and I mentioned in this article that I had been thinking about intimacy because of research I was doing for an upcoming article that I'm writing. This upcoming article is on the asexuality movement. And what really got me excited about this was an interview that I did with the founder of asexuality.org, David J., who you may have seen on MTV, The View, Montel, 2020, and etc., etc. Asexuality is a bit of a foreign concept and can be hard to wrap your head around, but the themes, languages, and ideas that David uses to talk about intimacy expound on a very human experience. And I think the result is valuable for anyone on their journey of self-discovery and exploration of relationships. So stay tuned for the article for more information on asexuality specifically, and see the show notes for more information on David J. The following is an excerpt from an interview I conducted with David J. on November 11, 2009, over video chat on Skype.
You were saying that there's not a set identity. Is there any stereotype that you see that you guys all have in common, though? A stereotypical asexual?
Stereotypical asexual?
Yeah.
I think it depends on... There's stereotypical categories of asexuals.
Okay.
That I will arrange in sort of a narrative, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And the narrative is one about intimacy. And this holds kind of true. This also gets to why I don't date asexual people.
So you don't date asexual people, you date sexual people?
I mean, not usually. I don't go out of my way to date asexual people.
Okay.
I like to say don't date asexual people because it makes me seem, like a shitty person. So in our society, intimacy is really, really strongly correlated with sex.
Mm-hmm.
The ability of someone to fully emotionally connect with someone else is largely sexualized. If you say intimacy, or if you say even relationship, there's an expectation that you're talking about sexual intimacy in a sexual relationship.
Right.
When there's a pretty strong case to be made that not all important relationships are sexual and not all intimacy on an emotional level is necessarily sexual.
Mm-hmm.
And because there's this strong association in our society, a lot of asexual people, the fact that I as an individual don't like the act of sex isn't necessarily that big a deal, right? It's something I can do with my body, it's kind of fun, but there's other fun things I can do with my body. It's not the end of the world if I don't have sex. If sex is a vital part of vital to my ability as a person to experience intimacy, then all of a sudden my lack of interest in sex is a big deal, because if sex equals intimacy and I can't I can't connect intimately with other people, then I'm missing out on a fundamental part of human experience, and I'm broken as a person. And that, I would say, you were talking about stereotypes about asexual people. I gave you some of the ones within the community. Outside of the community, the biggest stereotype is that asexual people are either unfuckable or broken, which kind of mean the same thing.
Right.
And that stereotype exists because there's an assumption in our society that sex and intimacy are intrinsically linked. So if you aren't into sex, you can't do intimacy.
Right.
And a lot of asexual people, that stereotype really impacts people. A lot of asexual people, before they find the community, feel broken.
Right.
And when I talked about sort of the early days of the internet, before the asexual community, all these people making up the word asexual to describe themselves, that's because they felt broken. Right. And they wanted a place to talk about it. And because people feel broken, the community is this incredibly validating experience. They show up, and we have a whole area of the website for this. They show up and they tell their life stories. They're really, really excited to find other people like them. And they tell their life stories and they say, this is what I've experienced. Am I asexual? I can't believe there's other people out there like me.
Right.
That's really, really common. And then there's a whole ritual in the community around validating people. So you arrive and people are like, yes, we experience the same things you do. Asexuality is a word. If it makes sense, use it. We're here to support you, regardless of what word you use. And that creates this really sort of strong, that experience of validation creates a really strong bond within the community and actually stops our community from having a lot of the drama issues that happen in most online forums because people really, really value the safety of the space.
Right. That's great too.
And so so asexual people usually start out feeling really broken, then move into this kind of time when they feel really validated and are trying to explore their asexual identity and are kind of thinking about coming out to people, thinking about how this impacts how they think about who they are in their lives. And that's usually a really positive time. And then asexual people usually get to the question of intimacy directly. So they'll say, okay, I'm asexual, I'm proud, I've come out this way, and this is kind of the path that my life took too. How do I connect with people? Which is sort of a scary prospect because most of the mechanisms that our society puts out there are kind of sexualized, right? Like Match.com is difficult to engage in as an asexual person.
Right.
Because there's assumption built into how it works, an assumption, sort of social assumption behind it that sex has to take place somewhere.
For sure.
And so asexual people kind of go from really down to up to kind of not as far, but down again, because they're struggling with questions about intimacy and how they're going to connect intimately with other people. And that's kind of internally, that's another stereotype I have about asexual people, is that there's this time when they get kind of down about intimacy. And what winds up happening is usually as a result of that, asexual people kind of begin to talk about what intimacy means to them and how they can achieve it on their own terms. And the result is this really fascinating dialogue about the nature of intimacy and all the different ways that it can exist in our lives.
Right.
And when it makes a couple of kind of interesting phenomena. First of all, in the asexual community, the word single doesn't exist. It gets used a little bit, but it doesn't really ever get used because single implies that if you're not in a romantic relationship, you don't have a valid source of intimacy in your life.
Right.
Where there's a lot of people that have extremely valid sources of intimacy that don't happen to be romantic. So instead of the word single, words like romantic and aromantic are thrown around.
Right. Okay.
And even among romantic people, there's this acknowledgement that if you don't happen to be in a partner relationship at this time, there's still really meaningful source of intimacy in your life that are worth talking about. That's the first phenomenon. The second phenomenon is that asexual people, when we gossip, we don't just talk about the relationships we're in. We talk about the relationship models we're in. And kind of every asexual person, there isn't really a unified paradigm yet, but every asexual person winds up developing, eventually, this entire elaborate worldview about how intimacy works and how their relationships fit together to make them happy. And you wind up talking about our respective worldviews on intimacy as much as we're talking about the actual relationship, sometimes more.
Yeah, I thought that maybe taking the sex out of it would free up more room to be emotionally adventurous or even intellectually in the relationship and in building the relationship and being vulnerable. And so many couples that I know don't do that. And that's such an important thing for me in my relationship. It would seem like it would come more naturally maybe to someone in an asexual relationship.
I don't know if it comes more naturally. I think we're sort of forced into it.
Right.
I think that if you're, and I'll tell you kind of the range of intimacy strategies that I see that the asexual community engaging in. But when asexual people who identify as romantic and form romantic relationships, which is maybe about half, and that, which is the most traditional that we get with the way that we do intimacy. Even there, you're forced to grapple with these really deep issues that a lot of especially straight sexual people aren't. Where you have to say, okay, if we're in a romantic relationship, what makes that relationship different than a really close friendship?
Right.
If I'm in both a non-sexual romantic relationship and a really close friendship, what is monogamy? At what point would I be cheating on my monogamous romantic partner with my best friend?
Right.
And you have to get into these deep discussions about, what about what we feel for one another makes this relationship special. And exactly what commitments do we need to make to one another in order for us to both feel safe and trusted. You have to get into a much more detailed discussion about that than some sexual couples might. Where a sexual couple, you can say the relationship's different because of sex. In order for us to trust one another, we have to not have sex with anyone else. End of story.
Right. Yeah. Cheating is sex, and sex is intercourse. Like, they don't even to what sex is, which I think that asexuals sort of shed light on too. What all of the things that sex are, which the queer community does as well.
Yeah, and that's big too. I mean, another big intellectual theme in the asexual community is that the kind of what I like to call breaking down the sexual binary. So any time that there's an assertion that a sexual thing is really fundamentally different than a non-sexual thing, we tend to challenge that. So if people say a sexual relationship is fundamentally different than a non-sexual relationship, we'll say why. And we'll go in and we'll take it apart and we'll sort of say, you know what? Here's some non-sexual relationships that really emotionally and in all other ways look pretty similar to sexual relationships.
Right.
And sex isn't necessarily the fact of it. If people say sexual activity is fundamentally different than non-sexual activity, we'll go in and we'll talk about how that's really a fuzzy line. Or people say sexual arousal is different than non-sexual arousal. Sexual desire is different than non-sexual desire. We'll kind of try to break apart that distinction. Because every time that people say sex is really important, it creates an implication that asexual people aren't having a full human experience, which generally we feel that we are.
Yeah, that's a really important one. I think that people have a hard time with that one. Like, I saw the episode when you were on The View, and I don't know the name of, like, the redhead on The View, but...
Oh, Joy?
What's her name?
I don't have the last name. She has her own show now. I totally want to go.
Okay. Well, the redhead, I'm pretty sure it was the redhead, was kind of like trying to challenge you and push you a little bit, like saying that you're repressed and whatnot. And I feel like for so long, people that are sex positive or even people that are like liberal have been sort of like putting their sex front and center to like deal with repression and deal with people that are repressed. So when you come out and say like, I'm asexual, it almost triggers them and they want to tell you that they're repressed as though it's like this, like for and against argument or something, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think that the stage that we land on in the sex positive community a lot of the time is that it's one where there's been this historical effort to repress sexuality and say that it's bad and you shouldn't talk about it because it's, dirty and nasty unless it's a marriage, in which case we still just shouldn't talk about it. And people saying, no, sex is an important part of people's lives and we need to talk about it openly. And I think that desire for a dialogue is at the core of the sex positive movement, and the same desire for dialogue is at the core of the asexual movement, in the asexual community. We want to create open, honest dialogue about asexuality, and we think that if your goal is to create an open, honest dialogue about sexuality, you should be talking about asexuality too.
Yeah.
And you should be celebrating sexuality. You should also be celebrating the fact that it's not like the desire to create a dialogue about sexuality, especially in our kind of very marketing driven culture, can easily turn into sort of over celebrating sexuality and glamorizing it, fetishizing it.
Right. Which I don't see that as sex positive either. You know, when the
I don't see
media
that as sex positive either, because it gives people, and I also don't see that. I don't think the sex positive community are really the ones doing that. I think that sort of their dialogue is sometimes co-opted by marketers, and then that's done. But I think there's an image of sex sold that is very, very unrealistic.
Right.
In terms of the promises that it makes about what it's going to feel like and what it's going to bring to people's lives.
Right, yeah. I just think of, like, Sex in the City, and, like, this is every girl in America's view of, like, sexuality, and I don't know. I don't think that shows sex positive either, and I think it's probably very far off.
Yeah.
From most
and then an honest dialogue about sex has to get into the fact that sex is sometimes boring.
Right, yeah.
And that there's other ways to connect with people, and, like, all the things that we want to talk about as asexual people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that asexuality creates a kind of important expansion of the sexual dialogue because it gives people permission to talk about not liking sex and still liking intimacy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right now, even in sex-positive spaces, if you start talking about how sex is sometimes boring, it has the same weight that we as asexual people feel, where there's this implication that, oh no, if I'm having trouble having sex, then I must be having trouble connecting with people intimately, and that's a really big deal. And I have to lower my voice and, you know, have a hand on my back in order to talk about it.
Right.
And that I think is a big problem because it curtails discussions happen around sex.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, you know, like sometimes I don't feel like chocolate ice cream. That's okay. Like, I was talking earlier about kind of intimacy strategies, the way that people in the asexual community seek intimacy. Mm-hmm. And I would define intimacy pretty broadly. I would say that it's an intimate relationship is one where you feel comfortable being vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and when you look at how asexual people talk about getting there, getting to this point where they're comfortable being vulnerable, some asexual people talk about it in partnerships, either in romantic partnerships or in incredibly close friendships. And that's really where they focus. They focus on one person. Mm-hmm. Some asexual people focus a lot more on communities, like I do, where we're kind of looking across a bunch of people and usually trying to kind of find a place where we can help people organize around their passions, and that's how we connect with people intimately, or how we create a sense of intimacy. And then some asexual people also do it through looking internally, where intimacy, they find intimacy in their relationship with themselves.
Sure.
Or in some sort of relationship that's not with a person. You know, it could be with a national park, it could be with animals, it could be with God or some other spiritual entity.
Right.
And kind of looking across those different ways of creating intimacy, there's, I'd say, a pretty strong idea, a reasonably strong idea in sexual. Well, I'll just say this personally. I would say if you define intimacy as something you do that's somewhere in between those three ways of acquiring it, it's something that everyone needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
And, you know, it's universal and it's human, and everyone should be challenging themselves to get it more fully and more completely.